You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. My guest is Dr. Theodore Piliszek. He's going to be a speaker at an event called medtech coming this December 2019. And Dr. Piliszek, he's the founder and medical director of the Advanced Health and Wellness Center in Houston, Texas. He has over 30 years international experience in preventative medicine on 3 different continents, and his practice is dedicated to functional longevity medicine and clinical nutrition and the prevention and reversal of generalized vascular, metabolic, and degenerative disease. So he's got a lot more background than that, but we'll keep it brief. And Ted, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, and we spoke offline briefly, but your current focus is anti-aging. Is that right? Or improving longevity?
You could, absolutely, but there are different ways of approaching it, certainly. One of my main interests is the nutrigenomics, which is the effect of food on our genetic expression. And that is so important because a lot of our patients want to know at a younger and younger age, are they at risk for any serious medical problems? And by evaluating their genome, their genomic expressions, we can give them a good idea of the risks that are involved and the manner in which one could delay or even prevent that happening.
When you say that food affects our genetic expression, are you talking about epigenetic changes due to food?
Correct. The epigenomic expressions, absolutely, which we're finding are so important. And the epigenomic effects include lifestyle, exercise style, and nutrition style of the individual.
Do you know of any work that's going on to characterize which epigenetic changes are heritable, pass along to the next generation?
Well, I think we do. Harvard is doing a study at the moment, and I believe so is Stanford. And they're trying to become more specific as time goes on because we are now, developing much more involved and extended manner of assessing one's genome by looking at the DNA. But going much more wider, you could say, looking at the whole exome of a genome, sequencing. So as a result, this boosts the scientific strength of the sensitivity and also the predictive value compared to any of the first generation analyses of our genomic interpretation. So there's a lot of very important research going on now with practical solutions. That's the beauty of it, because you can't keep everything in an ivory tower. You've got to bring it down to the level of the man and woman in the street, so to speak. And that's where I come in as a practicing clinician.
So what have you noticed in terms of nutrition and how it affects people's gene expression?
Well,
how would you even ascertain that?
Okay, we now know practically through experience with different populations around the world who have healthy longevity on their side, such as the Okinawan Islanders in south of the main islands of Japan, the northern Scandinavian countries, the Nordics in Sweden and Finland, the Mediterranean peoples of specifically Sardinia and the Greek islands, and also some populations in Central America, and also our own population in Loma Linda, California, by looking at their lifestyles, nutrition styles, and as a result, correlating those with actual biochemical testing. So we have learned quite a lot by looking at these people, these populations, seeing the sort of biomarkers that they, in fact, elucidate and show in the testing that we do through blood, sometimes saliva, and urine. So as a result of that, we have then been able to suggest certain nutritional eating styles or eating habits. Now, however, by looking at the genome of individuals, we can further delineate the risks that an individual has. And where it's very appropriate to my research, clinical research, is in trying to assess the risks for, in fact, dementia, because that is the biggest risk that most of the Western world populations have, in that, take the United States as an example, the UK, Germany, Italy, France. We are one of the worst populations regarding the risk for diabetes and prediabetes. We almost have 50% of the population at the moment who, in fact, are at risk for that. Diabetes type 2, and the problem with that is that type 2 diabetes puts in a risk for type 3 diabetes, which is actually Alzheimer's disease, tremendously. So that is the new nickname for Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes. So therefore, yes.
A question here: what you alluded to biomarkers that you're tracking, at least in, I guess, your local population clinically. What are some of the biomarkers, and what's the implication of them being at certain levels?
Absolutely. We look at oxidative stress because oxidation is one of the major problems that we deal with, too much oxidation. We look at inflammation as another major marker. So when you look at that from the point of view possibly of inflammation, you have C-reactive protein as a well-known one. Fibrinogen is another well-known one. Oxidized LDL is another one that is a really good marker for that. And then that's in the blood, you might say. Those are very good markers for possible inflammatory changes. Then when we look at the genetics, we look at ApoE genotype, which is one of the very important, in fact, genes, which in fact directs us. Initially, it was discovered, the ApoE genotype, where you have ApoE 2, 3, and 4, and depending on the actual phenotype presentation of the patient, whether there are 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4, or 3, 3, and 4, 4, the risk of cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's changes. So the worst one for Alzheimer's, the worst type combination is a 3, 4, and a 4, 4, ApoE 3, ApoE 4. If one has that, then your risk for Alzheimer's is certainly greater. So now we know that by instituting certain dietary habits, which we know will lower our biochemical biomarkers for inflammation, we can slow down the progression of the dementia. And we can pinpoint that by looking at, in fact, brain imaging. So brain imaging comes into the picture too. So we can see if there's any, so these are the latest findings, of whether there's any signs of atrophy of certain parts of the brain which are linked specifically to the development of dementia. Oftentimes the temporal lobe, bilateral temporal lobes, can now be measured through sophisticated algorithms, software using MRIs, where we can see what the degree of atrophy that is present and the rate at which it progresses. So these are some of the new developments that we find, in, just as an example, in the development of dementia, which is one of the biggest threats in our current population. And in fact, this is the one reason why I'm focusing on that. It's because it's going to be a very costly one for the whole country.
Is your goal more to determine risk factors, or is it
It's a combination.
I guess the other goal would be is if you modulate people's nutrition, clinically, what happens to the biomarkers that can change because of that?
Oh, they can change so quickly. But you have other lifestyle changes. Exercise, we now know that a modicum of exercise, not necessarily to kill you, but a modicum of exercise, aerobic exercise, generally speaking, which is really just a question of just walking enough. If you can get somebody to walk enough once they're past the age of 40, you can slow down the progression of dementia. They've done quite a number of studies on this too. Adequate sleep is another very important biomarker. We're finding that you could have too little sleep, and for most of us, because of the stressful lives that we have and the multitasking that we subject our bodies and minds to, which they're not made for, then we add extra stress to our bodies. So adding all those risk factors for many, many years will then result in an increased risk for dementia. Absolutely.
So what have you seen are the biggest levers in terms of nutrition, exercise, other lifestyle habits?
Well,
maybe relationships with people, instead of being isolated. What moves the needle most from what you've seen clinically?
Well, it's multifactorial, as I put it, because just to give you an idea, we now think that if you take a snapshot of the genetics of Alzheimer's, you've got at least probably 30 different genetic abnormalities that could be called into play. But some of them are more important than others. For instance, you've got the AP gene, which is the amyloid precursor protein. You've got the presenilin 1 and 2 genes, and then you've got the ApoE, apolipoprotein E genotype. Those are the major ones involved. But then there's a slew of other risk loci, as they call them, or functional membranes or functional points on one's chromosomes, which also lead to the increased risk for Alzheimer, you see. So therefore, when you go back to foods, let me give you an example. They've just completed a very, very useful study, a group out of Rush University here in the United States, where they compared the Mediterranean diet with the American Heart Association, the DASH diet. The DASH diet has been around for many years. The idea is by utilizing this diet, you lower your risk for hypertension, okay? Now, if you lower your risk for hypertension, specifically of the systolic, the upper limit of the blood pressure, and the diastolic, to do that adequately, you have to maintain, suppleness of your arterial tree throughout life. And up to about the last 10 years or so, we thought clinically that as you get older, your arteries get more solid. They get harder. They lose their suppleness. So they can't dilate and relax adequately. That is not true, because we found that different populations, especially long-lived ones, maintain the suppleness of their arteries till they die. That's one of the answers to the question of aging. You do get older, but you don't age. You remain young until you actually called to see your maker. And one of the reasons you're called to see your maker is when your ability to transform your cells disappears. That takes so many different cellular divisions. We don't want to get too complicated there. So to maintain that, the DASH diet has been a very, very useful addendum. They've combined it, the Rush people did, with a modified Mediterranean diet. So then they came up with what they called the MIND diet, which is an amalgam of the Mediterranean and the DASH diet from the American Heart Association. And the goal of that is to emulate the Mediterranean peoples, because a lot of us can have the sort of dietary modifications Mediterraneans employ. It's much more easier for us sometimes than even the Japanese diet, Okinawan diet, or even some of the Nordic diets where they eat whale meat and stuff like that. We're not used to that. But for the most part, we're used to Mediterranean dietary intake, okay? Now, there's also what is the important aspect of the Mediterranean diet? And that's very, very critical, because that is olive oil. the ones who live longest, who partake of the Mediterranean diet, in fact, are the ones who can put away, possibly the individuals, up to 8 tablespoons of olive oil a day. Hydroxytyrosol is the molecular component there, which one feels is the major antioxidant, that polyphenol that helps our genes remain young. So this is how, our discovery is sort of expanded. By every year, we're finding something new. So this is something that I've got most of my patients. I'm advising them on that, and see, I'm practicing myself too, to see how that affects my biomarkers, my biochemical bio. Some of the studies, that incorporate MRIs of the brain, etc., are a bit expensive, and you have to be in a research sort of group, otherwise you can't afford them. So usually we just stick to the simple matter of assessing biomarker productivity.
Have you looked into how our microbiome affects us and alters
Absolutely.
our gene expression, and how that partners with our nutrition and exercise?
Oh, yes, because that's the other brain. It's now called the other brain. The microbiome interacts with our cerebrum, or the main brain, through the vagus system, partly through the vagus system. And we've known that for years, but we couldn't put the two together. But now we're finding, again, because of genetics, we have more bacteria, beneficial bacteria in our gastrointestinal tract, especially in the large intestine, than we have cells in our body. So for a start. So the genetic makeup of the bacteria is of very, very great importance. So there must be a balance maintained at all times. And traditionally we used to think, well, if you have GERD, you have an imbalance, okay, that's the upper GI. If you've got alternating bouts of diarrhea, constipation, bloating, etc., then that might be a sign of imbalance in the lower gastrointestinal tract. But now we realize that everything is linked together. So the importance is to maintain a balance of your bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract through, and this is very, very important, probiotics and prebiotics. And we can make our own probiotics and prebiotics by ingesting the right foods. Usually they tend to be, if possible, fermented foods. So that's why fermented products are very, very useful to our gastrointestinal tract and our microbiome.
Yeah, I guess
if you need an example of those.
Oh, yeah, I guess like sauerkraut, kefir, yogurt, kombucha.
Yogurt, kefir, absolutely, especially the mornings, the sauerkraut, the kombucha, the kimchi, that type of thing, but also olives, any of the pickles. They're very good if you can watch the salt, because you don't want to push your blood pressure up. But yes, that's a critical factor now of having fermented foods on a daily basis.
Oh, it's weird if you think about it. Everything we eat becomes fermented by our gut bacteria anyway. So our guts are like
a bit slow. Right.
Yeah. So
but yes,
that's why
right.
I can see it would be an assist to eat something that's already been fermented, and then it's further fermented once we eat it as well.
Absolutely. And you know yourself, when you eat the right foods, you don't feel overfull, overstuffed afterwards, even though you're not hungry anymore. So that's rather interesting. Although there's now you might say, type of a trend. There are always trends in nutrition of looking at, because of the diabetic epidemic, to try and allow us to modify the foods and the time of eating. So we talk about episodic fasting. And I think that is a worthwhile approach depending on the individual and what their health problems are when they come, certainly.
What tends to consume your mind every day? What things are you trying to figure out that you tend to ruminate about a lot that are really puzzling you personally?
Well, it is nutritionally related. We're learning things about nutrition virtually every day. And one of the striking findings is the advantage of taking micronutrients. Touched on that. Whole foods are important, but whole foods cannot practically provide you with enough micronutrients such as water-soluble vitamins, which for the most part are B vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins are usually vitamins A, D, E, and K. Antioxidants are also important, glutathione, etc., which is vitamin C, which can act as both as a water-soluble vitamin and an antioxidant. And we now know that amino acids are important because we are one big protein. So you want to have the right building blocks for our protein, the ones that we make. So these micronutrients, as we call them, are very important because we have changed our living sort of approach. We are now doing so much more, partially because of the advances of technology, that we ever did in the past, our parents or grandparents did, and that places great stresses on us. So to counteract those stresses, we need more micronutrients, and I've found that I've had very good success by assessing micronutrient status in individuals and then trying to supplement those with intravenous vitamins and micronutrients with very, very good effect.
Is it, I've had many markers tested at labs, but I don't know. I mean, the tests for micronutrients, first of all, what are 5 or 10 micronutrients you found to be important? And then how do you find testing for it? Is it rare or is it pretty commonplace to find that stuff?
Oh, no, you can do it. You could look at the water-soluble vitamins. You've got B12, you've got folate, you've got B1, B2, B3, the standard ones, biotin. You could do this all through the blood. Fat-soluble, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, no problem with that. Vitamin E through the blood. And so it's glutathione we can check through the blood as well. We can check most of the vitamins and the amino acids too. Ones associated like serine, phosphatidylserine is readily available, ethanolamine. So we have a lot. And also fatty acids. We're now very cognizant of the fact that our brain especially is a 3-pound, average brain weighs about 3 pounds of a quivering fat composed of EPA, long-chain fatty acids, EPA, DHA, and DPA. That's abbreviations for docosahexaenoic acid, eicosapentaenoic acid, and so forth. So therefore, we're finding that to be able to maintain that quivering brain and not let it atrophy by supplying it with enough of the basic fatty acids, then you've got to eat the right foods, okay? The right foods are actually mostly fish-related. Fish-related such as the small fish. So that would be what? Anchovies, sardines, mackerel, herring. Then you come to the bigger fish, larger fish like salmon. But the trouble is, when the fish attains a size of about 10 inches to 12 inches, and we've seen the beautiful shots of the salmon going to spawn up the rivers in Alaska, and the bears waiting to catch them and eat them. The trouble with bigger fish, they can't survive on plankton and seaweed like the smaller ones do, so they tend to accumulate their impurities. So you probably should concentrate on the small fish, or otherwise, if you can't abide that fishy taste, then you should take probably micronutrients with the EPA and the DHA and the DPA derived from those fish. Absolutely. But that is excellent for the brain.
Okay. All the dietary recommendations you're giving, they all sound very familiar when I speak to, my dad or older people. Yes. They would eat pickled this and pickled that and fermented this and that and
Absolutely.
all that stuff that a lot of people turn their nose up at this kind of stuff, but a lot of it's very familiar. So that makes sense.
It is because tradition. We have to learn from tradition. Tradition teaches us a lot because it's usually the people who have practiced that type of lifestyle who live longest. Despite any other morbidities that they acquire, but they live longest. And the important thing, again, is to preserve your brain. So that is my focus for all my patients. Anybody over the age of 45, I'm in fact inclined to put them on this mind diet or modification of the mind diet that they could abide by and practice on a regular basis. And that certainly will, improve them over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because we are now looking at the age of 100 as not being that far away on an average. We're here about 87, 85, and that's in the United States. We've gone just past, I believe, 80, although some people say, well, it's still 78, 79. No, it's definitely past 80. But the Nordic people, like I said, the Sardinians, and also the Okinawans, they're hitting in the 90s, absolutely. But one of the other factors is exercise, too. You can't get away from that. You can't be sedentary.
Yeah. So what have you seen in clinic? What kind of, in the patient population that you work with, is it pretty dramatic, or what do you see?
You mean the changes?
Yeah, when they go on the right diet and exercise plan.
Absolutely. It's a dramatic change in their biochemistry. Absolutely. We can stop and reverse diabetes, but it's depending on the degree of diabetes, if somebody has diabetes type 2 when they come and see me. But yes, we first of all halt its progression and then carry on and start reversing it. Absolutely. You
mentioned Alzheimer's and dementia quite a bit, so it sounds like it's very important to you, which is good.
It is important. It's the most important threat facing the Western world at the moment. Absolutely.
My question here, though, is I've heard of many practitioners, thankfully, having a great impact on diabetes. But what about Alzheimer's and dementia? Do you have patients where you've been able to help them and their families do a dietary and exercise intervention, and has it had much effect, or is it at that point apparently not much can happen to change the person's outcome?
Well, it depends on how far they are by the time they come to see me. You see, I'm in the group associated with the likes of A4M, and we've been preaching this gospel of a holistic approach to medicine for many years. But the standardized medical approach has never focused on that. In fact, most physicians know diddly squat about nutrition, which this is changing. They now have programs for residents and fellows where they are actively teaching nutrition, clinical nutrition, which is, thank goodness, we've got to that stage. But for the most part, the old school don't know. In fact, for instance, if you have a patient who's been diagnosed with cancer, they have to have either IV therapy or radiation. Whenever you mention anything, for instance, regarding nutrition, they just shrug their shoulders. And they say, no, just regular food. And you ask them what is regular food, and the food that they talk about is actually the worst type of advice they could give. Because what happens when you get onto that anti-cancer treatment, many times it depletes the body of all the basic necessary micronutrients. They need a lot of micronutrients. This is one of the problems that we deal with at the moment, but things are definitely changing. So I'm gung-ho about that.
Yeah. Have you seen, again, when people have Alzheimer's or dementia,
yes,
is that typically too late? Have you seen dramatic changes at that point,
no,
or only subtle ones?
I have not. Maybe one or two pre-dementia patients, yes. But sometimes at that early stage of neurocognitive deficiency or failure, one can't be sure what you're looking at, whether it's, for instance, Alzheimer's, or is it Parkinson's, or is it Lewy body dementia, different types of dementia. But the most important thing is to be able to prevent, from my point of view, the cerebral atrophy, because that's a common finding that we have in those patients. So to prevent that, they must get adequate sleep, do exercise, have the right, any micronutrient deficiencies that we document must be replenished. So those are the sort of aspects of health that you address. And certainly I've seen early changes at the moment, certainly, a positive change. From the point of view, we have tests, written tests, and you can see whether somebody's different screening tests for dementia. So the changes are a little subtle, especially the earlier that you meet that individual. And sometimes it's difficult for us to refer them for screening, MRI screening, specifically to check the question of brain atrophy, because then you've got to do a serial study. That can get very expensive because insurances are loath to cover that. So those are the sort of negative aspects of all this.
So what advances are you expecting or hoping that will happen in the next maybe 4 or 5 years?
Okay, the most important is going to be the possibility of focusing on good nutrition. Now, having said that, as a clinician and fellow clinicians like myself, one fight that we have is with the media. Media is influenced by companies, by big agriculture, the food industry. Their ads are so potent, especially to the relatively young people, that and a lot of them, in fact, have a focus on fast food. So, unfortunately, the basis of fast food production is completely contrary to the sort of recommendations that one has for optimal nutrition. That's the only problem that I see. So sometimes, and I think what would help the nation as a whole, and this is being experimented with in the Scandinavian countries, that certain types of ads are being checked out by the government, and if they promise really too much, then they should be curtailed, because that is, you get a lot of misinformation posted through the media, unfortunately.
Very good. So we're just about out of time. What's the best way for people to find out more, and if they're local to you, maybe come see you in the clinic, or at least look into what you're doing specifically? How can they find out more?
Oh, yes. No, we have a website, and we have an email address, info@advancedhealthandwellness.com.
And the website itself is advancedhealthandwellness.com?
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay.
It is.
Very good. Well, Ted, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, no, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And let's see how you could edit it, and let me know. And hopefully it will be a positive product.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.